So I know it's been a while since I've made some videos, probably since about January, so 3 months or so. The reason for that is because I've been tied up with baby duties. My wife and I had a baby boy recently, so I haven't gone racing since he was born. But that doesn't mean that I have been sitting still, so to speak, when it comes to my RC collection. So uh, I've been getting into vintage Kyosho stuff again lately, and one model that has really caught my eye is the Kyosho Pro X. So that's this car right here, and I wanted to uh, have one that I could run at the Vintage Off-Road Nationals at some point, and I generally have a rule of thumb that I call the rule of two. So if I want to run a particular vintage car, I need to have at least two of them so that I could have one that's in new condition, that's on a shelf, that's preserved, and then another one that I beat the crap out of on the racetrack. So with the Pro X and other Kyosho models from that era, so the Pro XRT, which was their stadium truck, the Rampage Pro, the Outlaw Rampage Pro, those are their nitro versions of these chassis. They had a team version and a sport version. So the team version of the Pro X is what you see here. And the only real difference between the team version and the sport version is that the team version comes with ball bearings all around, and it comes with turnbuckles. I think these are aluminum turnbuckles. They don't look like titanium. And they also come with ultimate shocks. These are aluminum bodied shocks. The sport version, let's put that here, is, oops, sport version is what you see here, okay? This has conventional tie rods, has plastic body shocks, and it has metal bushings all around. So, you know, if you find a sport version, it's totally fine because it really isn't that big of a deal to upgrade to bearings, to upgrade to proper titanium turnbuckles, etc. So one of the things that were really interesting to me about the Pro X is the transmission. So if you look at the RC10 Worlds car, the Traxxas TRX3, which actually has a lot of similarities to, you know, other cars from this era, and the I think the Tamiya Dynastorm, although I could be wrong on that. But at least the Worlds car and the Traxxas TRX3 had a typical, just a standard 3-gear gearbox. And, you know, this, if you look at the gearbox here, it looks like a 3-gear gearbox. You have 1, 2, 3 gears here. It looks about the same size and shape as, say, an RC10 gearbox. But that's actually not entirely the case. This is called the SST gearbox. And the way it works is that the differential assembly is not at the bottom of the gearbox. It doesn't connect, it's not at this point here. The differential is actually in the middle here. And what that allows you to do is to use a screw to adjust the differential without taking anything out. So normally with, say, an RC10, if I need to adjust the thrust bearing, I'd have to, you know, pop out this ball cup, maybe take this wheel off, and then put a hex screw into the outdrive and adjust the diff, and then put everything back together. With the Pro X, you don't have that. You don't have to take anything apart. You just shove a screw in there and you tighten or loosen the diff, and then you're done. The disadvantage, of course, is that it does result in having more parts. So the way it ends up assembling is that you have a differential and then 2 gears on either side of the differential. And then these 2 gears drive these 2 other gears that go to the bottom of the gearbox. So let's see if I can find a picture here. So it looks like this. Okay, so you have your input gear, and then this directly drives your diff gear. Okay, and in this sense, the diff gear kind of acts as an idler gear of sorts. And then you have your differential action here, and then you have 2 gears on either side of the diff that are connected to the diff. And then those drive these 2 gears here that go to your diff out drives. And then that goes to your dog bones and to your wheels. So that's kind of an interesting setup. I assume it would increase the center of gravity of the gearbox because you have, you know, metal parts in this diff. You're moving the weight further up along the differential, so the center of gravity would be a little higher, which, back in the early 90s was probably not a problem because the tracks were much looser. And so maybe you wanted, a higher CG and or a lower roll center in order to maintain or to achieve reasonable cornering grip. But on modern tracks that are very hard packed and high grip, this may not be the best setup, unless you're on a low grip track. So that's one thing that was kind of interesting about this chassis. And the other thing that was rather peculiar, actually there are two things here. So I'll just go straight to the chassis itself. So on the RC10, you have an aluminum tub chassis, and the chassis and the nose plate are two separate pieces on the RC10. And that's also the case here, except that everything is molded. And the molded plastic here, it's a really, it looks like a very strong composite plastic. So this is not like the plastics you would get in an old Tamiya chassis. They're ABS plastic, and they're very easy to break. They're very brittle. This is actually very tough plastic. And if I just flip this over, you have your chassis, and then there's this, there's a nose plate here that actually extends further back, and it mounts, onto the chassis on the inside here, okay? And then, you use 1, 2, 3, 4 screws to mount the nose plate, and then another 4 screws up here to mount the front bulkhead that the suspension arms connect to. And you also have this top plate here. So in terms of rigidity, I would expect this chassis to be a little bit more rigid in terms of forward and aft flex compared to an RC10. This looks like a very rigid chassis. And the steering rack itself is also rather different from what you would see on an RC10. So if we go over here to the steering rack, that's where it's put together. It's this right here. So you see these arms here sweep out at a pretty steep angle away from the rack. And then, these connect to your steering linkages. I assume, this will change the steering geometry by some amount. As it is, there are no Ackerman adjustments on the steering rack as it comes out of the box, so to speak. But you could, if you really wanted to, drill some more holes in this rack if you want to adjust your Ackerman setup. And I think there's also, so this is another really interesting thing about this chassis. The way that the caster block mounts at such an angle is very different from, again, what you would see on an RC10. In RC10, the caster block is pretty much straight up or down, or it has a direct one-to-one relationship between the caster block angle and your camber angle. But the way the Pro X works is that the actual steering knuckle is angled down like this. And they kind of show you in the manual when you're putting it together right here. So if this caster block is straight up and down, the steering knuckle actually points downwards. So for some reason, again, it's probably a geometry trick. They designed it this way so that in order to get to, say, 0 or -1 caster, or camber, sorry, the caster block is, really tilted inwards. And maybe one reason for that is because with the caster block tilted further inwards for a given camber angle compared to an RC10, the camber linkage is shorter, assuming the inside position is the same. So this would enable you to run basically a higher camber gain than what you might get on an RC10. But these front suspension arms are longer. These suspension arms are more like what you would see on a modern car. The old RC10 had, rather short arms. Even the World's car had relatively short arms compared to what you see on a modern car, because the RC10 nose was wider than the nose you have here on the Pro X. So maybe they were just trying to get to a similar camber gain point as you have on, say, an RC10 with longer arms. And maybe that's why they designed this steering knuckle to be sort of angled down in order to achieve that geometry. That would be one guess if I had to guess. So This sport model, I plan on taking this and tearing it apart and rebuilding it and making this a runner. And because I actually have another team kit that's completely beat up that I'm going to use as kind of a parts car to help rebuild this. And I got to get bearings and turnbuckles and all that. I'll try to put Kyosho big bore shocks on it. Shouldn't be a problem for the front, but for the rear, I do think that it may, the big bore shocks are bigger such that the springs may end up rubbing into the body, so I may have to cut out part of the body in order to make the big bore shocks fit. We'll have to see. And just so you know, it'll be some time before I can actually make this a runner, because I barely had any time to work on any of my projects as it is. But this is on my list. It's on my short list of things to do. And I'm quite happy to have this. Now, since we're still on the topic of vintage Kyosho buggies, I wanted to show you this guy. So this is the Kyosho Rampage Pro. And as you can tell, based on the fact that it has tie rods rather than turnbuckles and plastic shock bodies, this is actually the sport model for the Rampage Pro. All you got to do is just add ultimate shocks, put turnbuckles on it, put bearings on it, and it's a team kit. Okay. Now, you could probably see where I'm going with this. I don't race nitro. I only race electric cars. And this would basically be a mid-motor buggy if you could, design a motor plate to fit to this gearbox and mount an electric motor going in this way. And as it turns out, I have a friend who is working on that for me as we speak. So it's actually this kit that I'm really interested in to make a runner for the Vintage Nationals. And I expect that it'll behave quite a lot like the Kyosho RB6, which is a mid-motor layout. There are a few minor differences. On the RB6, the shocks mount in front of the rear axles. Here, the shocks mount in the back, which I think is probably a good idea in this case, because there's not a whole lot of space back here to put weights behind the rear axle if you need more rear grip. So it's probably good to start with the shocks back here anyway. And this entire front end, the nose plate, the bulkhead, the top deck, everything with the exception of these two little posts here, this all can mount directly on. It's interchangeable with the Pro X. So I can literally just take the front end, just tear it off of this and plop it right on here. And there's just an extra parts bag I would need to get these two posts here, one here and one right here, to mount the top plate, and everything, it just drops right in. For the gearbox, even though this is a buggy, this gearbox is not the Pro X gearbox. This is actually a Pro XRT-like gearbox, or really an Outlaw Rampage Pro gearbox. So all that really means is that the number of teeth on the input gear is different. I think it's a larger number of teeth. And the diff gear and the output gears, I think they also have a different number of teeth between the truck models and the buggy models. So this is basically like a truck gearbox. So there's another Rampage Pro that I'm putting together. This is a brand new buggy. I got this off of eBay not long ago, and it's really nice. So again, I don't want to beat this up. So I'm trying to build another one from parts that I can turn into a runner. But I think this would be really cool as a runner. Nice mid-motor buggy. It would be a legitimate vintage buggy, because this is from 1993 or 1994, just like the Pro X. You can do some modernization with it. For example, the universals, since these are probably very hard to find as original, vintage parts, these I think are about the same size as the 65 millimeter Kyosho universals that you can get today for a Laser or an Ultima RB6 or RB5 even. So the only thing that I probably wouldn't be able to do that's modern would be the front wheels, because these are bearing housed wheels. So if I want to put hex wheels on this, then I'd probably have to get like an RB6 setup for the caster block and the spindle carrier. but I'd like to keep these parts vintage. So if you want to get 2.2 inch bearing housed front wheels, because these aren't 2.2 inch, I think they're 2 inch. I think Tamiya makes them, and you can get them in a variety of colors, so I'll probably do that. So this is my sort of pet project for the year that I want to get ready for Vonance later. So let's see. Is there anything else I wanted to mention about this? No, that should do it. Yeah, so I hope you find this interesting and intriguing. If you have a Rampage Pro, this would be a cool project for you to do an electric conversion. Same thing with the Outlaw Rampage Pro, same gearbox and everything. If you could just get a motor plate that's designed correctly, you could do an electric conversion, and it could be a lot of fun. Okay, so that's it for now. Thanks for watching.